Hey everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. It's almost fall wedding season, so I'm back this time with a stencil set from my Dynamic Duos collection that is wedding themed. If you may recall, about 2 years ago, I introduced a bridal set that was comprised of dress forms with wedding gowns and bridesmaids dresses on it. It was very much tailored to the women in the bridal party. So I thought I'd come back this time around with a male-themed or groomsman-themed version of that set. And that's what we're going to be working on today. As a reminder, my Dynamic Duo sets are comprised of 2 sets of stencils. A background set that has lots of decorative elements. In this case, it's the suits and tuxes and pants hanging on hangers. Then there's a corresponding or complementary message and frame set that has all these related messages, which you'll see. So we'll be diving into how to use the background set alone and then how to combine it with a message and frame set. All of these designs are designed in partnership with confectioncouturestencils.com, which is where you can find these stencils. I've also got a really cool Stencil of the Month club. If you're an avid stencil user, I would really encourage you checking it out. So basically what it does is it gives you the background set in my collection each month, along with a single stencil designed by my partner. And you get that at about a 15 to 20% discount off of what you'd get it if you bought it normally on the site. In addition, you get 15% off anything on the Confection Couture site as long as you stay a member. So it's a hugely good deal. So do check it out. We're going to move right into talking about what you'll need for this project. So here's what you need. At least 1 cookie. I'm hoping you'll want to do more when you get into the project. So set aside 3 or 4 iced cookies. I like to use white because it provides nice contrast with the black and blue that we're going to be using on this cookie, but you could also tint the background if you wanted a more subtle suggestion of color behind it. I'm working with a wide range of cookies for these, and these stencils do fit a wide range of cookies even though they have multiple components. You don't have to load every single component on every single cookie. So I've got some that use a very small cookie. It might be 2 inches across and 3 inches long. I've also got one that's more like 4 by 4. And you'll see variations, which I'm going to show you in a sec after we get through all these tools. You'll also need my stencil sets. They come in a package that looks something like this. The background set has a number of elements in it, which we'll get into as I get into working with it. But the 2 primary ones in this case are this background pinstripe pattern and then these elements that can be laid on top. Then there's the corresponding message and frame set, which contains messages, frames, masks, etc., which you can lay on the background. I might also need my quadrant masking tool, which is this handy tool for masking off parts of the stencil. So for instance, if I don't want another message on that message stencil to get in the line of spray, I can just put these over the other messages. Now to hold the stencils in place, we need a stencil frame or stencil genie designed by Ginny at Creative Cookier, who's a good friend of mine. It's an ingenious tool. You might also need a little tape to hold down the masks that I put on top to block out areas for some of the other elements that you can layer on top. I either use painter's tape or magnets or a combination of both to weigh them down. We're going to be airbrushing everything on these cookies today. You can also use royal icing in these stencils as long as it's applied as your last layer. If you apply it too soon in an earlier layer, the next stencil won't sit flat on it. In addition to that, we're going to be adding dimension through 3 different types of fondant techniques. One is my typical flat fondant applique, which is rolled fondant that's been airbrushed and then cut around. I do those in a lot of my videos. They're fun. I've done them both with the messages here and also with some of these other elements, the pants and the tux and the jacket. In addition to that, I've got what I would call a modeled piece of fondant. This has been shaped into a bow tie. That one's a little long. I've got different sizes. And then I've got a third piece, which is an extruded piece of fondant, which is pushed through a tool, which I'm about to show you, to create a rod. We're going to use this in lieu of stenciling on the clothes pole. In some cases, we'll be using this as an elevated hanger. Of course, I need fondant. I've got it covered because it rapidly dries out. In this case, we'll be using the white for behind the message plaques and the clothing. we'll be using the gray to extrude, and we'll be using this teal color to make the bow ties. Now, I was talking about extruding. To extrude fondant into fun shapes that are dimensional, there's this device called a fondant extruder. You unscrew it, rotate this back to allow room for fondant. You load it with fondant, and then you slip discs of various types. It comes with 10 or 12 different discs. I'm using a small, about 1/8 inch circle in mine to create that hole. Put that on the end, screw it down, and then twist it in the opposite direction, and this long string will come out, but I'll show you that as we make those parts. As I mentioned, we're airbrushing everything. I am going to be using 2 colors only, but adding interest through shading techniques, in particular with the black. So I'm going to be putting it down very softly as a gray and then highlighting aspects of the stencil to accentuate them by applying the gray again and again and again until it becomes black. So to do that, I like to work with alcohol-based colors. They tend to distribute more evenly. And as I get to the saturated colors that require repetitions of color on top, they're less likely to pool. Now, I should say that this blue is particularly intense. Most blues are. So I've toned it down substantially by putting just a skewerful into a whole cup of white in this cavity to make a very, very light color. I want a very light background color on this to be blue, and if I use it straight up, it's just too strong. I think I've covered all the tools, but wait a minute. For rolling out the fondant, you need a pasta machine. It's a little too hefty for me to have on the counter here. I like to roll my fondant into thin sheets through a pasta machine because I can get a really, really fine sheet. You can also use a fondant rolling pin. Now, before I clean this up and get into working with the background set, I want to show you some of the possibilities that you can make with these 2 sets combined. So here are some options. All of these in the back row use the background set alone without a message and frame associated with it in different combinations. Here you can see a lot of action even on a very small cookie. Here I've got 2 elements, etc. One thing to point out is the pinstripe pattern we're working with is this big one at the end. This is what landed in my final set. I go through an intense design process, just a little sideline here to test these stencils to make sure that they look great, but also that they laser cut properly. Originally, we had a very fine pinstripe pattern that you see on all these other cookies. I made them before we discovered the trouble. But in looking at the stencil closely, the pinstripes weren't straight. There was a waviness to them. And that's because these holes were so tiny that the laser that cuts them overheated the plastic, caused it to warp, and the line just didn't cut straight. So we increased it gradually, because I liked the delicate nature of the pinstripe until we reached a size that would consistently cut with the laser cutter without making them crooked. But the consequence of that is I could have used a very dark blue with the tiny pattern and it wouldn't be so dominant. However, when the pinstripe is opened up, that same blue looks really, really dark. So that was another reason for me lightening up that blue so much so it wouldn't compete with the foreground elements. In the foreground row, you see the message and frame set obviously worked into the mix. In this case, it's airbrushed directly on the cookie. Here, it's on a fondant applique that's elevated slightly off the level of the cookie. I'll be doing various designs throughout and coming back to talk about some other design variations as we get into the video. Let's talk about what's in the background set before we dive into using it. First of all, there's a background stencil, which is this larger pinstripe pattern I mentioned before. This is a little sideline. Again, I alluded to this earlier. We had trouble laser cutting it initially when it was fine. All these areas I've circled are little areas where there's a little jog in the stencil where it goes a little wacky. And that's the reason we spent time trying to correct it, just so you'd have a perfectly straight pinstripe. So we've got that background piece. Onto that, you can lay these various masks. Let me pull them in. We've got 5 of them in this case, which is a lot for a set. Pants, box with hat, hanging jacket, tuxedo, and this bar for hanging clothes. And they can be laid in various parts, in various ways on the stencil to mask off areas to receive detailed stencils that go in those spots. The only mask that I don't customarily use is this slender one for the pole. It's really hard to anchor down. And because I'm doing it in a dark color over a light background, I can just leave it unmasked and superimpose it later. So that's typically what I do with that piece. If you want to mask it, you can, but it's a little challenging to do that. Now we've got what I call the foreground stencil, which is all the elements that then get laid into those voids you've created by masking off the background. Lots of detail here. We're going to be airbrushing them all in black in various shades, starting with a gray and then progressing to a more saturated black to pick up some of the details in them. And lastly, there's a shading stencil, which is simply all the negative spaces left over after the masks have been pulled out. I sometimes use these for creating halo effects around pieces or shading in certain elements that need shading in. Since I'm going to be largely stenciling that completely in black, leaving no areas left to be shaded, I probably won't use it here, but I'll definitely use the equivalent piece when we get to the message and frame set. So the first step is to secure the background in the stencil genie or frame and then tape down the mask wherever you want it on the stencil. In this case, I'm using the suit. Now to airbrush the blue pinstripes, I'm operating at a 90-degree angle with limited pullback on the trigger, and I'm trying to airbrush parallel to the stripe or along the direction of the stripe. That will produce less underspray. That looks great. Now I'm laying in the foreground element where I had masked off the suit. I'm going to start by shading very lightly with black. This is black lightened with a little spectrum flow white, so it appears gray. And now I'm going to come back in and highlight, if you will, with pure black, the edges of the suit coat and all of the details. So I'm getting a lot of depth and dimension with just one color, essentially. And there you have it. Now I want to put the pole down. As noted, I don't mask off the pole because I'm using black over blue and spraying that black relatively dark. It'll cover the blue without needing a mask there. Okay, so we're done with that. I'm really pleased with the blue background color, but I'm not entirely pleased with what I did with the black. We'll use it as a learning point. I really wanted more variation between the body of the coat. I wanted that to be light gray and all the details to be very black. So I think I had two troubles. One, I wasn't close enough to the stencil as I was airbrushing, and this airbrush was cutting in and out a little bit. The spray was a little intermittent and might have been being clogged a little bit by the white food coloring. So what I was really going for was something more like so, where just the details here are really black and the edges of the coat. We're going to do it again with a message, so hopefully I'll get better control on it this time. But what is nice about it is I left a lot of space here for messages, frames, and other embellishments, which we'll get to in a bit. Let's talk about what's in the message and frame set before I start applying it. One thing to note, it's thundering out and it's crazy jarring on my nerves to have the thunder come up unexpectedly when I'm doing detailed airbrushing work. So please forgive me if my airbrushing is a little more erratic than usual. Message and frame set consists of frames. In this case, there are only two. Sometimes there are four in a set. And it also contains the little masking pieces that'll make room for those frames on the background stencil. We've got two of them that correspond. Once those voids are created by those masking pieces, I've got four different messages that can fit in those two possible frames. So they are designed to line up this way if you match the tabs at the top. So this one will always fit in whatever is there. Likewise, that one will fit there. And if there were a frame here, that would fit it. However, that doesn't mean they can't be mixed and matched. For instance, Be My Ring Man fits over here. Will You Be My Best Man fits up here. They're designed to be as interchangeable as possible, which is the beauty of it. Now there's also this other element. Again, we have the corresponding shading element in the background set that I didn't use. This is just the negative piece that's left over after the masks are cut out. And I am going to use this to shadow around the messages in this case to show you how that works. Okay, the first step, as before, is to secure the background stencil from the background set in the Stencil Genie. Now I'm also securing a mask with tape from the message and frame set. This is going to leave room for a little framed message. Once again, airbrushing the pinstripes parallel to them to avoid underspray. I may have to go over this a couple of times to get even coloration across the board. It's best to apply the coloring gradually though, as opposed to too much in one area at once, as you can sometimes get pooling of coloring on top and then underspray. But that looks good. Now I am going to use the shading stencil that I didn't use last time to create kind of a shadow around the message, but I do need to mask off with my quadrant masking tool, that right hand side, so I don't get black airbrush coloring on the rest of the cookie. I shaded at a distance to create just a halo or soft effect of black there, as you can see. Now I'm applying black more intensely into the frame to provide contrast, and I'm spraying here at closer distance than when I shade. That looks great. Coming in again with my message at close range here. Again, applying the coloring gradually so it doesn't pool up and run underneath the stencil. And as before, I'm laying a pole that message is hanging off of. I don't need to have masked off the pole because I'm going over blue, but I do need to mask off the left side of the cookie so I don't get airbrush coloring there, because it is pretty close to the pole. Coming in again, airbrushing parallel to the stripe here to avoid underspray, and that looks pretty darn good. Now to the fun dimensional stuff. I'm going to do 3 types of things, as I mentioned at the beginning. My typical flat fondant applique with a little bit of a twist. I am going to shape it a little bit after I cut it out to give some angle to the little hanger here. So that way, once I make the second element, which is the extruded clothes pole, it'll look more like it's hanging over it. I can kind of loop it around it a bit. Then we're going to make the extruded pole here with a little bit of a detail at the end, a little bauble at the end. And then lastly, the most interesting element perhaps are these dimensional bow ties, also fondant piece. Let's start with the airbrush piece. Since I have those tools already out, we're going to start by rolling that fondant very, very thin through my pasta machine, starting on the 1 setting and then taking it down to 3 or 4. So the number 1 setting is the most open setting, about 1/8 of an inch between the rollers, and that's too thick for my taste. I do want to start there though, because if I jam it down on the final setting, it'll just tear the fondant. So I'm going to progress through till I get to number 3 or number 4, which will take this down to about 1/16 of an inch thick. The thinner the fondant, I believe, the more palatable the piece is in the end cookie. Now that piece is super long. I clearly don't need that much, so I'm going to cut it down to manageable portions. I'm just going to be airbrushing a suit coat or a pants element onto it. I'm going to put it on a piece of cardboard, cake cardboard, for more stability as I airbrush, and place the stencil on top. Shading as I started out before with the gray, which is black lightened with white, and then coming in and adding low lights, more saturated color if you will, in all the details. The hanger, along the edges to really define the element, and down that stripe in the middle of the pants. Again, airbrushing perpendicular to the fondant to avoid underspray. That looks pretty good. Now we want to trim it out while the fondant is still pliable. If we wait too long, the fondant will crack or tear. And I'm just using the tip of a paring knife to cut around what I've airbrushed, sometimes using the side of the paring knife to kind of pat in any rough edges and to smooth them out. This can be a tedious process, but this is a pretty simple shape, so it'll go pretty quickly. I'm going to start with some broad cuts though, just to get this excess fondant out of the way. And a little trick here to cut round shapes, I like to use the tip of a pastry tip, the end of a pastry tip. Now proceeding with the tip of my paring knife to get all the other detailed areas cut out, patting here against the edge of the paring knife to smooth out the fondant. And we just proceed all the way around until it's nicely trimmed out. It's looking pretty good. Just going to pat in some rough edges with the side of my knife. And now I want to shape it as I mentioned before. I'm going to rest it on a piece of dried fondant, but I am going to dust it to make sure that the wet fondant doesn't stick to the dry fondant. And I'm just going to hang that handle over the edge a little bit and then press it down. In fact, I might even shape it around a pre-existing pole so that it conforms exactly to it. And what I'm trying to do here is just shape the hanger so that when I put this on the final cookie, it looks like it's wrapped around the pole. We'll set that aside to dry, ideally overnight. Now onto the pole itself, I'm using my fondant extruder. I've got a 3/16 inch disc that I'm going to use. And I'll have a link to this product in the video description. filling the cavity in the extruder with gray fondant, replacing the disc, and then screwing that down. And once that's in place, I simply crank the handle and that little piece of fondant will come out in just the right thickness for a closed pull for this cookie. That's a little wiggly and curvy, but we'll straighten that out once we get it down onto the cardboard. I'm going to trim that down to size, roughly, and if there's any wave to it, you can get that out most easily by just straightening the piece between two straight edges or rulers, like so. And here's one that's previously been dried overnight. I just want to show you how I'm going to detail it. I'm going to hang it over the edge of the cardboard a little bit so I can get a little black dot on the end to simulate a little knob on the end of the pole. And here I'm using black royal icing of beadwork consistency. Once that's dry, I'll turn it around and get the other edge, or leave it without the knob on the other edge until I put it on the cookie, because I may need to break that pole down to a smaller size. Now onto some blue fondant rolled out to the same thickness as before to make the bow ties. I start by cutting a straight edge and then sliding my ruler over. Actually, I'm going to mark the distance here about 3/8 of an inch, and then place my ruler again to cut out a long strip. And this will form the body of the bow tie. I'm going to cut a thinner strip, about 1/8 of an inch thick or wide, to be the center of the bow tie. Now I want to put a little pleat in the middle, and my hands are a little too clunky to do that. So I'm going to take the ends of 2 small paintbrushes and just sort of cinch it or pinch it together in the middle, and that looks really clean. Then I'm going to lightly dampen the back of the thinner strip with water so it adheres to the fondant. We're going to lay that on top, and that's going to become the center of the bow tie. I want to trim down the edges here because obviously a bow tie wouldn't be that long. And we'll flip this over and then wrap the central ribbon around the bow tie and pinch it in the back, cutting off any excess. And then again, simply set that aside to dry, trim it down a little bit more if needed. And once that's dry, it'll be easy to handle and put on a cookie. So I'm going to start putting these together. This is basically a pasting process where I take thick white royal icing glue and stick things down. If I want them a little higher off the cookie, I might put a little blob of fondant underneath. I'm going to actually put the elements on first and then come in afterwards and border, because I don't think the elements are going to overhang the cookie too much. And I'm afraid if I put the borders on first and then the elements on, I might mess up the borders getting those elements on. These are the 2 cookies I did earlier. And I'm going to show you different applications of different things, elevating some pieces, not elevating others. And I'm going to try to use all 3 elements that we created earlier, the bow ties, the closed poles, and these flat fondant appliques. Let's decorate that first cookie I did. I want to elevate a message next to the soup coat, and I'm doing that by adhering a little bit of fondant to the cookie itself, and then I'll stick the dried message directly on top of it. You could stick it directly on the cookie, but this just gives it a little more dimension. And I think I'm going to attach a little bow there to the hanger. That looks sweet. Again, I'm using thick white royal icing glue. White icing is just easier to clean off a cookie if I make a mistake. And the thicker it is, the faster it'll dry. I don't think this needs much more other than a little border to define the edge. Here I'm using my icing of beadwork consistency, and I'm using black just to really define that edge nicely and to tie into the black in the center of the cookie. Now onto the second cookie. I'm going to bring in some of the other elements, the closed pole and the pants that I cut out earlier, elevating the pants once again with fondant, sticking the bow tie directly on the cookie, and I want to give a finishing dot to that closed pole now that I've got it broken down to size. And once again, defining the border or the edges with a little bit of royal icing of beadwork consistency. I don't need a fancy border here. This cookie I want to keep pretty crisp and clean. And we'll just continue all the way around until the cookie's finished. My royal icing consistency adjustments can be found in a link in the video description, as can my royal icing recipe. And that looks great. So that's how my new groomsman set works. Pretty simple. Again, here's an array of possibilities in front of you, but the design possibilities are nearly limitless. Before I let you go, just a reminder, do take advantage of my Stencil of the Month Club if you're doing any amount of stenciling, because there are huge savings involved. And also I have a big announcement, which I should have made at the front of the video. And that's that I'm now available for live online chats, video chats, via the platform SuperPeer. I'm offering both 30 and 60-minute consultations. So if you have questions about this video that you want to spend more time understanding, or if you have questions about some other technique, or if you even want to do a mini decorating session with me, that's all possible. There is a nominal charge for these sessions to cover my time in preparation and also to help subsidize these free videos that I bring to you on YouTube. But you'll find all of that information in the video description under the SuperPeer link. I look forward to meeting you there, and until next video, live sweetly.